Well, good evening. Welcome to Wednesday in the Chapel at Central. I'm George P. Wood, and we are concluding today our series on the problems of evil. So if you are here for something more fun, you're in the wrong place right now. I always have fun, but I don't know if anybody in the audience does. So there we go. But you're going to Wheaton, so this kind of stuff is Augustana too, of course. Now I'm going to feel bad because these two twin brothers are going to separate colleges, and as a Wheaton graduate, I'm very biased, but whatever. Let's begin tonight with a word of prayer, and then we'll dive right into the topic. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for the rain. Thank you for all the many blessings that you give us in the material world and the physical realm. But Lord, most of all, thank you for your Son, Jesus Christ, who loved us and gave himself for us so that we could, beginning today, spend our entire eternal life with you. Be with us, Lord, as we study this topic tonight. Help us to be honest inquirers and to be thoughtful people. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So, we have been talking for the last few weeks about the problems of evil. There's not one problem of evil. Typically, when people refer to the problem of evil, they're talking about what I call the philosophical problem of evil. But let me just real quickly again run through the review so you can see how we've developed the topic over the course of the 4 sessions we've had together. So in the first session, we talked about the existential problem, which is something that believers face about how do we reconcile our belief in God with our experience of suffering. And I suggested that biblical religion provides resources for doing that, especially through the prayers of lament, which really focus on turning to God in the midst of suffering or evil rather than turning away from him. Then in the second session, we looked at the philosophical problem of evil, which is typically what people mean when they talk about the problem of evil. And we looked at 2 versions of it, the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem. And what I suggested is that the logical problem of evil really isn't a live issue anymore because it's very difficult to prove logically that a all-good, all-knowing, all-loving God might not have some sufficient reason to allow some degree of suffering in the world. And that same kind of consideration applies to the evidential argument, which is this notion that maybe the amount or kinds of evil and suffering that we experience constitutes an argument against God's existence. We took a week off. Joe Dallas was here to talk about LGBT conversations. And so last week in our 3rd session, we talked about the biblical problem of evil. It's one thing to talk about God sort of in the abstract as this all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful God. It's another thing to deal with the details of the Bible. And so there are passages in Scripture that seem to portray God as doing something that we would take to be evil. And so we specifically focused on Deuteronomy 7 and 20, which talk about how God commanded the Israelites to treat the Canaanites. And so I offered some ways of working through what those passages mean. And then in tonight's session, our 4th session together, I want to sort of turn the tables and talk about what I call the atheist problem of evil, which is how do I reconcile the existence of good and evil with a naturalistic worldview as a matter of logic and evidence? And maybe that framing, which has been up on the PowerPoint slides the entire time, I'm going to talk more about logic than evidence, but again, it's just sort of a philosophical presentation on whether or not an atheistic worldview can make sense of this common sense belief that we have that some things are right and wrong. And so I'll try and develop that tonight. And of course, as always, I'll try and leave as much time for Q&A as I can. However, I, as my wife will tell you, I often discuss things beginning with the history of the sundial. So sometimes I just run long. So if you start to nod off, just start pointing to your watch, okay? And that will keep me on time because I know my wife will. So in order to sort of get into this topic, I want to give you a quotation. Now, let me see if I can get this to work properly. Yes. So I'm going to give you a quotation from Richard Taylor, who is a philosopher, not a Christian philosopher necessarily, in his book, Ethics, Faith, and Reason. And so he makes this observation. A hawk that seizes a fish from the sea kills it, but does not murder it. And another hawk that seizes that fish from the talons of the first takes it, but does not steal it, for none of these things is forbidden. Now, I think that this expresses what you might call common sense. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as folk psychology, this notion that somehow humans are different than other animals, or folk morality, the fact that rules apply to us but not to other species. And I want that to be the starting point of this discussion because, killing and taking are common behaviors in nature, all right? The poet said that nature is red in tooth and claw. And so, you have preys and you have predators, and the predators are always chasing the prey and eating them, okay? In the animal world, we don't even bat an eye about this. Nobody looks at the hawk that kills the fish and says, "Oh, that's so immoral." However, there are any number of vegetarians who would say to a human who catch a fish and kill it and eat it, "Well, that's immoral," okay? So, killing and taking are common natural behaviors. As Richard Taylor points out, animals are permitted to do them. There's no law forbidding them. In fact, most of us just believe it's silly to try and apply moral rules to non-human species. On the other hand, humans interpret taking and killing, at least some forms of taking and killing, as stealing and murder, respectively. We don't consider, for instance, killing in self-defense murder, so there's some nuance there. But if you're out fishing and your neighbor catches 10 fish and you go and take all 10 from him without his permission, and then when he tries to defend himself, you kill him, nobody's going to say, "Well, I'm just a hawk and a fish," okay? They would say, "You're a human being and you are morally responsible." And so that raises really two questions. Why are animals and humans treated differently? And that raises then the second question is that given that animals and humans are treated differently, why are some behaviors right or wrong? So those are the two questions that I get out of that quote. And the reason why I ask them is because they frame the discussion, especially that second question of why some behaviors are right and wrong. Now, when we look at nature, and especially these kinds of examples from nature, and especially how we interpret them, there's fish, and then there's us. Animals can do stuff that we cannot do. You have to basically say, well, why is that the case? And so in his book, Mere Christianity, which I know many of you have read, C.S. Lewis says that, at least in the modern West, there are two basic perspectives that orient to how people answer those questions. And so the first is what he calls the materialistic view. And here he says people who take the materialistic view think that matter and space just happen to exist and always have existed, nobody knows why, and that the matter behaving in certain fixed ways has just happened by a sort of fluke to produce creatures like ourselves who are able to think. Now, if you take that view, what I'm going to be suggesting tonight is that it's very difficult to explain why it is that we treat humans and animals differently, because after all, humans are just very evolved mammals under an evolutionary or atheistic point of view. So while we might say there's an absolute distinction between humans and animals, they would say there's only a developmental or evolutionary difference. It's not a difference of kind, it's just a difference of quality, as if we're a fundamentally different thing than animals. It's just that we are more. It's a thing of quantity. It's just we are more. We're more intelligent, more whatever, okay? On the other hand, Lewis talks about what he calls the religious view. And he says, according to it, what is behind the universe is more like a mind than it is like anything else we know. That is to say, it is conscious and has purposes, and prefers one thing to another. And on this view, it made the universe, partly for purposes we do not know, but partly, at any rate, in order to produce creatures like itself. I mean, like itself to the extent of having minds. Now, here, Lewis is speaking pretty abstractly. He hasn't yet gotten to the whole point of Christianity yet. In fact, he gives a bunch of different examples of religious-type worldviews, not all of which are consistent with one another. But the point is that on the one hand, you have a materialistic view that says what exists is a fluke that just happened to produce us. And then you have another more religious point of view which says that there's intention and reason and purpose behind our existence. And Lewis's argument in the first part of Mere Christianity is simply that those two worldviews produce very different outcomes, and especially that the materialistic view or the atheistic view simply cannot explain a fundamental part of our moral universe, which is why we are different than other animals and why things are right and wrong, even though for other animals it would be wrong, it would be stupid to apply those kinds of beliefs to their behaviors. Does that make sense? Okay, so let me just run you through a sort of a summary of Lewis's argument using his own words. This is one passage, these next three slides. It comes from the first section of Mere Christianity, which is right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. Notice he says clue, not silver bullet argument. And I've said this repeatedly throughout our series. In philosophy, there are very few silver bullet arguments. In theology, there are very few silver bullet arguments. And I mean, it's just try this one weird trick and it will solve all your problems with atheists. That's just not the way these arguments work. But I like the way that he puts it. This is a clue. There's something going on with this distinction between right and wrong that points us in a direction that if we keep thinking about it, will lead to a belief in God. So Lewis, of course, if you know anything about his biography, Lewis was raised in a Protestant family in Ulster, North Ireland. His father was nominally religious, at least. He was raised in the Church of Ireland, which is the Irish version of the Church of England, so he was what we would call Anglican. And at sometime in his teen years and into his college years, he just became an atheist. And his atheism expressed itself, oddly enough, through his love of philosophy. But the philosophy of that time was not a very appealing philosophy because it was very atheistic, very dour and depressing, and the universe has no meaning, and there's no purpose in life, and there are no rules, and just, he didn't like that. He also had, however, a love of literature. That was the romantic side of his brain. So he had a rationalist side and a romantic side. And what he eventually found in his late 20s, under the influence of people like J.R.R. Tolkien and some other people with whom he was lifelong friends, is that Christianity brought together both the rational side, which explained the way things are, but also the romantic side, which gave a reason why these things are important and beautiful. But he starts with kind of where his belief was as an atheist. He says, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. Right? And can we all agree the universe seems pretty cruel and unjust? An asteroid hundreds of thousands of years ago comes, flying out of the Oort cloud, lands in what is today the Gulf of Mexico. In fact, it makes the Gulf of Mexico, wipes out all the dinosaurs, and here we are today. What was the point of that? Lots of suffering there. And even now with humans, you get humans. Not only does suffering just happen to happen with asteroids falling out of the sky and natural disasters, now you got humans who are inventing ways of being cruel, right? So my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be a part of this show, find myself in violent reaction against it? And here you have, I think, what you might call sort of a common sense reaction to a philosophy that can't really make sense of your common sense intuitions about right and wrong, about truth and falseness. So it goes on to say, a man feels wet when he falls into the water because man is not a water animal. A fish would not feel wet. That's an interesting insight. Does a fish feel wet? I don't know how C.S. Lewis got into the mind of the fish to know whether it felt wet. I imagine if the fish was out of water, it would quickly learn what it meant to feel dry. But anyway. Lewis goes on to say, of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too, for the argument was dependent on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my fancies. In other words, this is a very brilliant insight. For the for the problem of evil to work as an argument for atheism and against belief in God, you actually have to have some sort of notion that things aren't just hurtful or helpful, painful or pleasurable, but right or wrong. If you give up the notion of the distinction between right and wrong, then it's not really a good argument against God. Because your argument against God assumes that there is such a thing as right and wrong, and God's not doing anything about it, and God should and would do something about it, so he can't exist. Does that make sense? So then he goes on to conclude this way. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, and he means senseless in the sense of irrational or didn't make sense or something like that, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. And I don't know, whoever typed this thing has so many typos in here that I'm just noticing. When I get back to work, I'm going to fire my secretary. By the way, I am my own secretary. So. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there were no light in the universe and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know it was dark. Dark would be a word without meaning. And so Lewis's argument is that atheism, especially in its use of the problem of evil to say that God doesn't exist, assumes a standard of justice, but it can't actually provide that standard of justice because it says, hey, we're just chunks of matter floating purposely through space who got here by dumb luck and have been determined in all of our choices by all the things that preceded us, and when we died, that's the end, and there was really no point to the whole show. You cannot have a materialistic view of the universe and also have, Lewis is arguing, a view of justice. Now, I imagine, I haven't been advancing these, have I? Well, I haven't been, but he has been, so let's all thank him, all right? So you might be thinking to yourself, oh, George, of course you're quoting a Christian and an apologist to say that atheists don't believe in all this stuff, but come on, are atheists really that obnoxious? Yes, at least some of them are. So one of my favorite books is a book by Alex Rosenberg called The Atheist Guide to Reality. Now, Alex Rosenberg is a professor of philosophy, God bless him. He wouldn't want to be blessed by God, whom he doesn't believe exists. But he's not at some minor obscure school. He's at Duke University, okay? And so he has this list of things that, of answers to questions about reality. Okay, and this is all quotes from him. The next few slides, two slides, all quotes from his book, The Atheist Guide to Reality. And so the question part and the answer both come from Alex Rosenberg. Is there a God? No. What is the nature of reality? What physics says it is. This is the belief. There's two parts of this belief: materialism, which is what physics explains, and then scientism, which is that only science can really explain reality. So if you only believe that matter is reality, then the only way to understand it is through science. So I don't know why he's a philosopher, but whatever. What is the purpose of the universe? There is none. What is the meaning of life? Ditto. Why am I here? Just dumb luck. Does prayer work? Of course not. Is there a soul? Is it immortal? Are you kidding? Is there free will? Not a chance. What happens when we die? Everything pretty much goes on as before, except us. What is the difference between right and wrong, good and evil? There is no moral difference between them. Now, he believes that there is a difference. Maybe it's the difference between pleasure and pain, or usefulness and not usefulness, but he's very careful with his words here. He says there's no moral difference between them. Morality, in other words, is just a way of explaining something else. It's just a sort of it's a coat of paint that it's that goop that you patch a hole in the wall with and then paint over to hide. The reality is the hole in the wall. Everything else is just covering that up, okay? There is no moral difference between right and wrong. Now, there may be a difference, obviously if you get killed, that's painful. Maybe if you're some weirdo like Ted Bundy, killing somebody brings you pleasure, but there's nothing right or wrong about the distinction between killing and being killed. So, there's no moral difference between right and wrong. Why should I be moral? Because it makes you feel better than being immoral. Unless it doesn't. And the only reason I say that is because, and I hope this doesn't make you all think that I'm a total weirdo, but I love crime novels. Is there anybody else like murder mysteries and espionage stuff? So we took the kids to the library one weekend, and I didn't see any crime novels that I hadn't already read, but I saw a book about real serial killers. Now, I normally don't read true crime fiction because, frankly, anybody who reads true crime fiction is just weird, especially about serial killers. Reminds me of this time I had to take Tiffany's car down to Nixa, I think, to get it fixed. And I'm sitting there and I'm reading a biography of, all people, Charles Manson. And I'm sitting in the reception and the lady looks over me with this, the receptionist looks over me with this sort of weird look, and I felt the need, obviously, to apologize. I said, look, I don't normally read this kind of stuff because it's creepy, but I read a good review and it looked interesting, and so, I'm reading this book on Charles Manson. I apologize if that creeps you out. She says, well, actually, my brother dated Sharon Tate's sister and was the gardener at Roman Polanski's estate. And I'm like, ooh, you ever played 6 Degrees of Separation? That makes 4 degrees of separation from Charles Manson for me. So I have no idea why I told you that. Oh, I'll tell you why. Because in reading this book about serial killers, many of the serial killers actually liked what they did. It provided them some sense of pleasure or release. So it's all well and good for Alex Rosenberg to say, well, you don't do what's wrong because it would make you unhappy, or it would make you feel you should do what's right because it makes you feel better than doing what's immoral. But doesn't that, by the way, seem to assume that you should do what makes you feel happy? Okay? But that's a moral distinction. Anytime you see should language, that's basically hiding morality. So if he's saying you should do what makes you happy, he's bringing morality into the back door. But of course, if he says you should do whatever you want, whether it makes you happy or not, he's still got the obligation problem, but now he just sounds dumb, because who wants to do what makes them unhappy? So then he goes on to say, is abortion, euthanasia, suicide, paying taxes? I actually felt a measure of sympathy for Alex Rosenberg at this point when he said paying taxes. Foreign aid or anything else you don't like, forbidden, permissible, or sometimes obligatory. Anything goes. Okay. Now, I imagine that Alex Rosenberg would object if one of his students pulled out a gun and pointed it at his head. I don't know, based on having just read that, what the moral objection would be. Maybe he would say, oh, that's going to hurt. What if the other kid said, but I like it? What's the response once you say anything goes? So those are Alex Rosenberg's statements. Let me make sure I've gotten through all of those. The only reason I brought those up is because sometimes it's hard for people to believe that actually atheists believe some of this stuff. Now, a lot of atheists work very hard against these notions that somehow atheism can't explain the difference between right or wrong. And I'm not talking about whether atheists can be good people. I'm talking about whether atheism is good moral philosophy. I know a lot of bad Christians, and I know a few good atheists. Their respective moral and immoral behaviors do not prove the truth or falsity of their belief. What they show is whether or not that person is any good. But you can often find people who have false religious systems who are still good neighbors. Okay? So what we're talking about here is a philosophical system, not people. So make sure that that's clear. I'm not making the argument that atheists are always bad people. They're not like Anselm's version of God, a being greater than which none can be conceived. Atheists are not worse than which none can be conceived. That's not the way it works. I'm just saying something about atheism. So now that we have C.S. Lewis, and now that I've shown you that there are, in fact, atheists who believe fairly extreme versions of what Lewis was getting at when he said that atheism, which other terms for atheism might be naturalism or materialism. Atheism, when we use the term atheism, we're focusing on the fact that they don't believe in God. But typically, their belief system actually has positive beliefs. So naturalism, what exists is nature, and only nature, defined as this sort of nexus of chemical and physical causes and effects. Materialism, same kind of deal. There's carbon in the universe, and everything's built out of that, and the rest is just on the periodic table, okay? So when I'm talking about atheism or materialism or naturalism, that's what I mean. For me, those are interchangeable terms. And the predominant form of atheism in America and in Western Europe is what you might call evolutionary naturalism. Naturalism is the belief that only nature exists and that evolution best explains how it got here and why it is the way that it is. Okay? So given what I've said about Lewis, given what I've said about Alex Rosenberg, I want to spend the rest of this time kind of trying to make an argument, trying to put those ideas into a formal argument form, okay? And so I have a couple of slides here that make a logical argument about what this is. And this is the moral argument for God's existence, but it's also the moral argument against atheism. So let's just begin with a common sense observation about humanity. And that is that humans distinguish right from wrong. I think we can all agree with that. Even Alex Rosenberg may say that there's no moral distinction between right and wrong, but even he would distinguish between pleasure and pain and say you should choose pleasure. But that's just a moral distinction. And so humans alone among the creatures on earth make this distinction between right and wrong, good and bad, virtue and vice, justice and injustice, flourishing and cruelty, those kinds of things. And second of all, it's not just that they make this distinction, it's that the distinction is unavoidable. You can talk about moral relativism all you want. Oh, there are no moral rules. That's actually moral nihilism. There's no inherent moral distinctions between right and wrong. You can talk about that all you want, but inevitably, people revert to should language, which is moral language. So if you go and steal Alex Rosenberg's car, he's not going to say, it's no big deal. It doesn't matter. There's no meaning in the universe. You taking my car, there's no moral distinction whatsoever. It gave you pleasure. Alex Rosenberg wouldn't say that. Nobody says that. You hit somebody, they say, that's not fair. You shouldn't have taken my stuff. Give it back. Even if they say moral distinctions between right and wrong are really just distinctions between pleasure and pain, there's always the assumption that we should choose what's pleasurable rather than what's painful. I have never seen anyone argue that we should consistently choose what is painful for us. Again, should. Now, we may make dumb decisions and choose stuff that's painful for us, but most people say you should avoid them. So not only is this distinction between right and wrong constantly made by humans, but it's really unavoidable. I don't think you will ever meet a human being, even an insane human being, who doesn't use the language of right and wrong, unfair and fair, equal or unequal, all those kinds of things. So then the third premise of this argument is that the distinction is either part of objective reality or part of subjective reality. And what I mean by that is the distinction between right and wrong is either baked into the universe as it is, it's either baked into existence as it is, or it's something that subjective people, it's something that we sort of impose on reality. So again, an atheist or a materialist or a naturalist view says matter exists, there's no reason for it, there's no purpose behind it, there's no right or wrong to it. And so they have a very hard time saying, well, right and wrong, therefore, are part of objective reality. Why? How do you get reason from unreason? How do you get right and wrong from no right and wrong? How do you get purpose from no purpose, right? If you get those things, it's because human beings impose their will on those things. And they find what is pleasurable to them, and they say that's what's right or that's what's wrong. And so objective reality means that regardless of whether you like it or not, will it or not, choose it or not, think it or not, murder is wrong. Always, for everyone, anywhere. That would be the distinction between killing and life. That is just part of the way the universe is. And so you will find older philosophers talking about the law of nature, not meaning scientific natural laws, but meaning what Lewis calls the law of human nature. That these moral rules that we have this obligation to keep. So humans distinguish right from wrong. The distinction is unavoidable. The distinction is either part of objective reality or it's part of subjective reality. Now here's the thing. Most atheists, if not all atheists, think that the distinction between right and wrong is part of subjective reality. So if it's part of subjective reality, Lewis argues, the distinction arises from instinct, convention, utility, or choice. Let me explain those four terms. If you read evolutionary moral literature, they will say that the moral instinct, which they reduce to altruism, is an evolutionary strategy for survival. Sometimes I think that a lot of us think of evolution as a survival of the fittest in which everybody is competing and they're going to kill each other, and it's a very selfish, individualistic thing. Evolutionists and evolutionary psychologists, evolutionary ethicists say, well, actually, fighting for scarce resources is one survival strategy, but so is sharing resources. And so evolution would teach us that we have both a self-protecting instinct and an altruistic instinct. And so they would say that ethics is basically us writing rules based on those instincts. And the reason that we cooperate is because we're biologically determined to cooperate because it helps our species survive. Here's the problem, though, and Lewis points this out. If you have an instinct to preserve your own life and an instinct to help others, what happens when those two instincts come into conflict? You're walking, I think he uses this example, you're walking by a burning building. You see in the second floor a person who is in that burning building and is clearly calling out for help. Your instinct for self-preservation says, keep walking, brother. There's no point in you getting burned too. Sorry, dude, bye. Your altruistic instinct says, rush into the flames and rescue the person who cannot help themselves. Now, at that point, an evolution has to say, well, these are both legitimate survival strategies, so we can't really say one is better than the other, and hence we can't say one is moral and the other is not. But Lewis says that's really not the way morality works. Morality is what decides between our instincts in those two cases. And there's a reason why we consider people who rush into burning buildings heroes, but we don't consider the person who just keeps walking a hero. And so morality can't just be our instincts because our instincts pull in different directions. Morality is what decides between those instincts. Does that make sense? Social convention. Morality, the moral distinction between right and wrong, is just the way a society says stuff. So, the reason why we don't like theft is that our group has determined that stealing from one guy is not a good thing. It doesn't work for group harmony, and so we've just rationalized those moral rules into our practice, but really it's only group preference. You can quickly see the flaw with this, right? The flaw with this is, Nazi Germany. They had very interesting social conventions. They liked to put Jews in ovens. Now, what is exactly the moral argument? If your belief is that morality is merely a social convention, what's your argument against the Nazi German social convention? That it's wrong? Well, if it's wrong, then the wrongness is up here and the social convention is down here. The wrongness judges the social convention. So the social convention can't be what determines what's right and wrong. What's right and wrong is something other than social convention. Does that make sense? So then there's a third thing maybe that it is. Maybe it's utility. Utility is usefulness. So there's a whole school of ethics called utilitarianism. It's a lot of atheists gravitate toward utilitarianism. And utilitarianism basically says that that's what is right is what does the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Of course, the problem with that is that, again, what happens if the greatest number of people become happiest if they kill Jews? And so then they say, well, there's a version of utilitarianism called rule utilitarianism, which is very hypothetical. And they say, well, we will make rules based on what theoretically does the best good for the most number, and to avoid that problem. But you really still have the same problem. Once you say what's good and bad is what is most useful for most people, there's always going to be some group who's going to suffer for that. Because human beings like to act in tribes. We like to act in groups. We like to distinguish between us and them. And so then that leaves us just with personal choice. Lewis talks about this as personal fancy. I think all of you can see what's the problem is here. I mean, it's wonderful if Pope John Paul II, his personal fancy happens to be helping other people and giving to the poor and being kind to people and speaking the truth. But what if you're Ted Bundy and your personal fancy is killing women? And so ethics seems to, this moral distinction between right and wrong seems to be something distinct from those four things. It's not evolutionary instinct. It's not social convention. It's not utility. And it's not merely private fancy. In fact, if you think about it, it's that moral distinction that above all of those things that we are constantly saying, well, you should do this. If it's the greatest good for the greatest number, you should do this. But that implies that morality is not determined solely by utility. Morality pushes you to help the greatest number that you can. Does that make sense? All right. I know this is really philosophical, probably more philosophical than the philosophical part, but it's going somewhere. So, the distinction between right and wrong does not arise from instinct, convention, utility, or choice. Okay? I think I've tried to make a short argument as to why that is. Therefore, the distinction between right and wrong is not part of subjective reality. Maybe somebody could come up with some additional dimension, but I think that some additional dimension, in addition to instinct, utility, social convention, and choice, is going to suffer the same problems. So, human beings distinguish right from wrong. The distinction is unavoidable. The distinction is either part of objective reality or subjective reality. If it's a part of subjective reality, the distinction arises from instinct, convention, utility, and choice. But, in fact, the distinction does not arise from instinct, convention, utility, or choice. Therefore, the distinction is not part of subjective reality. Okay, follow? So, if 3 is true, the distinction is either part of objective reality or subjective reality. And if 6 is true, that the distinction is not a part of subjective reality, then that means the distinction between right and wrong is part of objective reality. Now we have to get into this notion that it's not just that we impose meaning or impose morality or impose an ethical view of things on a purposeless, random matter. What we're saying is that reality comes baked in with the distinction between right and wrong, the distinction between vice and virtue, the distinction between justice and cruelty, etc. Okay? So that distinction, that moral distinction, is part of objective reality. Now, 8. Are we on 8 now? Whoops, did I go too far? For atheists, evolution explains all objective reality. Now, I have to admit here, there are forms of atheism, Eastern forms of atheism, that are not based on evolution, okay? Buddhism, a lot of people don't know this, but Buddhism, in probably its oldest, purest form, is atheistic. It doesn't believe in God or gods. But it doesn't believe that on the basis of science and evolution, okay? Western atheism, contemporary atheism, the kind of atheism you will most commonly encounter today if you turn on the internet or read Richard Dawkins or read Christopher Hitchens or whatever, ultimately they're going to say that evolution, the fact of evolution, of this process of development, that explains all of objective reality. Now, evolution is random, purposeless, non-rational, and amoral physico-chemical process. A lot of adjectives in there, but it basically means that everything that happens in the material world because of these inexorable laws of biology and physics and chemistry operating randomly on whatever happens to exist, and there's no superintending mind guiding the process. It just is what it is. Which means that reason arises from unreason, morality arises from unmorality, etc. There's no purpose that arises from purpose. We impose it on the world. Now, I want to suggest if evolution is true, the distinction between right and wrong is part of subjective reality, not objective reality. In other words, if this remorseless physical, chemical process that is not rational, has no purpose, happens randomly, if that in fact explains all of objective reality, you're never going to get objective morality out of that. And most atheists who believe in evolution get that. And so they start arguing for utilitarianism or for evolutionary instinct or whatnot. So now that we come to this conclusion, go back to what I said in premise 7. Okay? See 7 at the bottom? The distinction between right and wrong is part of objective reality. That's the conclusion from those first 6 premises taken together. Now we're at premise 11. Either 7 can be true, that the distinction between right and wrong is part of objective reality, or 10 is true. If evolution is true, the distinction between right and wrong is part of subjective reality, not objective reality. So either of those 2 propositions can be true, but not both. But we already know that the moral distinction between right and wrong has to be part of objective reality. So the conclusion of 10 is clearly false. So we have to say it's not 10, and therefore it's 7. Now, you may be thinking, what kind of argument is that? It's a modus tollens argument. If P, therefore Q, not Q, therefore not P. Okay? Or not Q, therefore... No. Hold on, I got to think through this. There's a modus tollens in here somewhere, and there's also a disjunctive syllogism. A disjunctive syllogism says either this or that, this, therefore not that. Does that make sense? So maybe this one is the disjunctive one. I told you we were going to get in the weeds. I apologize. My wife is just already giving me dirty looks. Now, if you take 7, that the distinction between right and wrong is part of objective reality, and you take 8, for atheists, evolution explains all objective reality, and if you take 10 through 12, then you have to come to the conclusion that atheism does not explain all objective reality. Why? Because if atheism is true, and atheism believes that evolution explains all of objective reality, but it also believes that morality is subjective, if that conclusion is false, you have to work back your way through that, and you say, evolution, in fact, cannot explain why the distinction between right and wrong is objective, so atheism gets something very, very wrong. Does that make sense? All right. Mercifully, we are coming to the end. So we come to this, once you've put all those premises together, that either atheism explains all objective reality, or theism does. Now, It might have been better to simply say either atheism explains all objective reality or it doesn't. Since we've concluded that it doesn't, we have to conclude that atheism is to a certain degree false. But if the choice is between atheism and theism, then on this point, theism has the better argument. Does that make sense? All right. So given that, theism at least can provide an explanation for all of objective reality in at least the sense that it can also explain not only the origins of the universe and the process by which it came to be and all those physical laws and logical laws and whatnot, it can also explain the moral distinction between right and wrong that atheism cannot. Does that make sense? I think that the first 13 points in this argument follow real tightly. In 14 and 15, I get much looser, okay? And so if I were talking with an atheist and having an argument with them, I'd have to do a lot more work on 14 and 15. Because they would basically say, you're saying that if atheism can't explain this, then belief in God is the default option. And my answer to that would be, well, yeah, that's just kind of the way it is. Either it's atheism or theism. So if it's not atheism, it's the alternative, okay? But if you're arguing with people, you can't just show the flaws in their arguments. You have to show the strengths of your own argument. And what I've basically done is tried to lead all of us down the road to see that atheism cannot explain a fundamental part of human experience. And that this is one of its great flaws. A flaw that I think is pretty fatal, which then would open the door to an alternative explanation. As a Christian, I believe that God would provide an alternative explanation. But you have to realize that when you argue with people, hopefully in a nice, kind way, not in the sort of way, there's going to be a lot of pushback. None of you are pushing back, okay? I don't think any of you are angry atheists who really hate this whole session, okay? You're probably all nice Christians who are just here to, load your guns with the ammunition that you're going to use on your crazy nephew who's gone astray after living all his life in church, okay? So obviously, if you're a Christian, you can't just assume because you showed the flaws in the other person's argument that yours results. So I'm doing a lot of work in the 14th and 15th proposition that they need more work. Also, we always constantly need to keep in mind that there are few silver bullet arguments. At any point in the argument that I've made, an atheist is going to push back. And the pushback is really going to come specifically in this notion that subjective reality can't provide a good explanation of the distinction between right and wrong. Now, I think that it doesn't, and I think that the type of arguments that you're going to say to rebut any counter-arguments are going to be along the lines that I've already given. And then finally, I think that sometimes we are looking for silver bullet arguments because we don't want to do the hard work of personal relationship. I find this often in the Christian community, and it's somewhat troubling that, the archetypal nephew who goes to college and takes a philosophy class and loses his faith and then becomes militant about it. Oftentimes, aunts and uncles and moms and dads and grandmas and grandpas and brothers and sisters will come in and say, well, I need an argument to refute this. Because we think that an argument will, once it refutes a person, will lead them to the truth, and then all will be well in our family again, and we won't have those awkward Thanksgiving conversations when we all say, and now let us bow our heads to pray. Okay? You understand what I'm saying? The reality is that just as Christians don't think that the philosophical problem of evil constitutes a great argument against their belief, a lot of atheists aren't going to believe these types of arguments constitute a great argument because of their belief, because they're bringing a lot more to bear. They're taking into account everything that they believe. My uncle, he's very religious. He's a jerk. So he's always arguing with people, and he always thinks he knows more than anybody else, but he's actually never cracked open a book. So they're bringing that element to the table. And they're bringing abuse from religious leaders to the table. And they're bringing their science courses that they've studied in college, which pretty conclusively seem to demonstrate that something like a process of evolution has occurred. They're bringing that to the table. And they're evaluating your silver bullet argument in terms of everything they know, just as you evaluate as Christians the problem of evil silver bullet argument in light of the totality of what you believe. And so while arguments are important because God created us to be rational, truth-seeking people, oftentimes they are not, well, actually never, they're never a substitute for a relationship. I read a book not long ago on deconversion, which is when people leave the faith. And he's specifically looking at people who deconverted from Christianity to atheism. And he said one of the most sad findings in his research is that Christian family members often abruptly and meanly ended their relationship with family members who had become atheists. Which, as far as the atheists were concerned, just confirmed their deconversion. These people are jerks. They talk about love. They talk about morality. They talk about Christianity and theism providing a better basis for moral distinctions between right and wrong, but my God, they're horrible people. Okay? And so while this focuses on an argument, we should never assume that an argument can be a substitute for a relationship. The two have to take place in tandem. You've got to have the relationship where somebody wants to talk to you. And when you talk to that person, it can't be as a substitute for a relationship with them. And so I'm a firm believer that when we do apologetics, which is a sort of defense of the faith, we should, of course, bring our best logic and reasoning to the table. But we should bring our best selves to the table because we're representing Jesus. And while there are people who see the light of day through philosophical reasoning, interestingly enough, Lewis was one of them. Far more people come because they are loved, and it's that love that enables them to examine their own beliefs in a new light. Does that make sense? So, with that, I think I'm done with the slides. I can't remember now because my slides are all messed up. Yes, I'm done with the slides. So why don't we do a little Q&A? I actually didn't talk as long as I did the last 3 weeks. My wife is almost proud of me. Question in the back.
I have a question, but I just have a comment. Thank you for that very last statement that you said. Love. My husband right here came to the Lord Jesus Christ because a church loved him. Thank you.
Yep. Now, the only thing that I would add to that is that just as truth is not a substitute for love, so love isn't a substitute for truth. Right? Jesus said, he talked about being full of grace and truth. Jesus, in his entire being, he was full of grace and truth. That should describe the way Christians live. Because we don't want to be stupid but loving people any more than we want to be smart but hateful people. Okay? Part of a full understanding of Christian discipleship means that we are working toward excellence in all dimensions of life, in how we think, and how we feel, and how we relate, and what we do, and what we say. And so what I have found is that sometimes you will find churches that really go to the truth side of the equation, and they have an argument for everything. And often the arguments, I think, are persuasive, they're well-made, etc. But they're just, who cares? Because they're just not good people. On the other hand, I found, especially today, that you will have a lot of churches that are just so into love and tolerance that they can't draw any moral distinctions, even though those moral distinctions might steer people clear of behaviors that are not good for them. And so it's not either or, it's both and. And unfortunately, I don't know if it's because of our personality types or just what it is, that churches often, major in one or the other. We need to have a double major, or at least we have a major with a very strong minor, okay? You understand? Okay, another question?
Okay, I might have missed this in the previous week since I'm just jumping into the series, but can you define how you're using subjective and objective? I think I know what I would define them as, but how are you using them?
Yeah, it's an easy distinction to grasp if you're thinking in metaphors, but it's not an easy distinction to define literally. So if you think of, probably the easiest way to think of it is that the subjective is what's taking place in your own brain, how you're feeling, what you're thinking, how you're perceiving, what you're desiring. And the subjective is merely that, okay? It's merely what's taking place within you. The objective is what's taking place regardless of whether you're around to observe it. Okay? It's something that by definition is outside of you. Not only in terms of outside of your brain, your perception of it, your feelings about it. It's just you can take yourself totally out of the equation and you're still dealing with the objective. So an example of the subjective and the objective. Okay, we're all Pentecostal, so I'll use a Pentecostal example. Imagine an atheist comes to church. Who knows why? Grandma dragged him, whatever, and he's never been to Central Assembly of God. So he's sitting there just glowering in the third row because grandma likes to sit near the pastor. He's just, I can't believe this stuff. And somebody 7 rows back all of a sudden stands up and starts speaking in tongues, loudly, insistently, emotionally. He turns around and he starts to think, these people are crazy. This is the height of irrational behavior. This woman is just acting, or man, is just acting out of their emotionality, and they're just cackling. His interpretation of the event is subjective. It's happening inside of him. In reality, the lady 7 rows back, or the man, is a nice, kind person who is very generous with the poor, and they are speaking in tongues. Now notice our interpretation of what they are doing is also subjective. But at some point, there's got to be some interpretation that closely aligns with what's actually happening, okay? And so subjective is merely what's happening inside your brain, while objective is what is completely happening apart from you. And so there's reality, and then there is what's happening in it. Again, I'm speaking in metaphors. Objective is what's outside of you. Subjective is what's inside of you. So when it comes to morality, the notion that the distinction between right and wrong is part of objective reality is known as moral realism, precisely because it says that moral distinctions are real. They're not dependent on our perceiving that they're real or that we're feeling that they're real. They're not dependent on our instincts, our subjective judgments, or anything else. They're just there. We see them, we perceive them, rather than we create them. So that's moral realism. Non-realism, moral non-realism, or subjectivism simply says that we bring those moral distinctions to the party. If the party is reality, our moral distinctions wouldn't be part of reality unless we brought them. Okay? Again, metaphors. But do you kind of get the idea? The basic idea is that it really doesn't matter whether or not human beings have even evolved. Maybe this is a good way of putting it for atheists. If moral realism is true, if the distinction between right and wrong is part of objective reality, then murder was wrong before humans evolved. Because murder is simply part of the way things are as much as, let's say, the law of gravity. It's different than a scientific law, but it's no less real because of that. Okay? Does that help at all, Desiree? Yeah. I mean, have you ever tried to define terms? Like, define the term is without using the term is, am, are, was, were, be, being, been, have, has, had, do, does, did, shall, will, should, would, may, might, must, can, could. I remember all my helping verbs, okay? defining terms is very difficult, which is why we often resort to metaphors. And I think that the metaphor helps us get at the gist of what we're talking about when we're talking about whether the moral distinction between right and wrong is objective or subjective. The fact of the matter is that regardless of whether it's objective or subjective, it's unavoidable. People always make distinctions between right and wrong, what we should do and should be and shouldn't do. The only question is that something that they do because just like things fall toward the center of the earth under the law of gravity, we perceive that these are laws of human nature that have to be obeyed. So, hope that helps. Yeah, Rebecca. Whoever. All right, let's actually just all start raising our hands so she has to run all over the room, because that would just really be fun.
So, kind of speaking on definitions and the definition of love, I've noticed in certain circles that love is defined as total acceptance, or it's defined differently now. And when we're showing love, people can reject that because they feel that that's not love to them. Have you experienced that or noticed that at all? And what would be something that you could we could do to, or just, I guess, in relationship, work on to be able to show love?
Right. So, again, definitions are hard. So often, if we don't resort to metaphors, we resort to examples. And so the notion that love involves no judgment about another person's behavior, it involves tolerating whatever they choose to do or be, is I believe often something that is believed only by people who do not have children or pets. What I mean by that is that often when we love someone, we direct them away from the things that will harm them. Now, doing that involves making a judgment about what is good and bad, helpful and harmful, right and wrong. And not only that judgment should be applied in how we relate to that person so that they don't choose what is good or, what is bad and harmful or wrong, okay? Just an obvious common sense example. Nobody ever says, because I love my toddler, I will allow him to put his hand over the open flame on my grill. I mean, you'd be prosecuted for child abuse, at least for negligence, right? So notice there, what we're trying to do is get at this notion of an example in which I think everybody would agree, oh, yeah. Obviously, if you love somebody, you want what's best for them. And that means, by the way, that you're immediately making a judgment about what's worst. Now, some people are going to be less interventionist than others, and can we all admit that some parenting styles are a little too helicopter and other parenting styles are a little too free range? Same thing with all of our relationships. Sometimes maybe we should speak up, and sometimes maybe we should shut up, okay? But notice that in no instance are we saying that love means making no judgments whatsoever. Another thing that I would say is an example is sort of what I would think is a common sense distinction is that you can make a judgment about a behavior or an attitude or a message, but that doesn't necessarily mean, you're a bad person, you're an awful person, you're going to hell. I mean, again, in parenting, sometimes it's tricky. Because obviously a murderer is not just a murderer. If murder is bad and somebody does it, then that person is bad, okay? But when you're parenting, you typically don't say, you're bad. Or if you do say you're bad, you're really just shaming your kid and you're probably going to have them in counseling for the rest of their life. And, what we say is this is bad or this is wrong or that will hurt you. And so again, you intervene lovingly in order to steer people away from stuff that's harmful to them. Now, the fact is that the older a person gets, they're going to develop their own perceptions of what's harmful, and so they may disagree with you. That's when I think things really get tough. And, for all of these adult converts to atheism that this book that I read talked about, they just got to the point where they just said, I'm old enough, and this is how I perceive things. And I'm willing to have a relationship with my family, but my family is not willing to have a relationship with me. And that demonstrates that they don't love me. And I think that maybe is where we get in terms of love. Obviously, fundamental disagreements about reality, about theology, about morality, about politics, all of those things can strain relationships. But they should not break relationships. And for Christians, I don't know that there is such a thing as a breaking of relationship in the name of Jesus until Jesus himself comes and renders a final judgment. That's why you find the New Testament constantly urging people to be patient with people and to, extend grace to the sinner. Even in the passages where it talks about excommunication, you turn these people over to Satan. Or, expel them from the church and treat them like tax collectors and sinners. Okay, that sounds awful. That sounds like cutting off the relationship and shunning them. Except when you go back and you look at how Jesus treated tax collectors and sinners. Or what he did for people who were oppressed by the devil. So, absent the final judgment, I don't know that Christians have the right or the authority to say of a relationship, it's over and done with because they don't agree with me. Now, obviously, if somebody doesn't want to be in a relationship with you, you cannot force the issue. And I think a lot of Christians go wrong here. Your kids start getting an opinion, a mind of their own. I've got a 12-year-old. We're going to be in the next few years entering this phase. And they say, I don't want to go to church. My default is to say, I don't really care. I'm paying for your room and board in college. Get in the car, Well, I think that there's a place for that because sometimes it's just passing emotion. Somebody's having a bad day. They just want to go to church. But there's also a point at which Christians say, I am not going to impose my faith on you because that's not the way God did things. He did not send a baby to the golden throne of Jerusalem. He sent a baby to the manger of Bethlehem to save us. He sent somebody that everybody could approach, who was inviting, rather than somebody that nobody could approach unless commanded. So, love means you're still making moral judgments about what's right and wrong, but you're not willing to break relationship. That's why Paul says, insofar as it is up to you, be at peace with all people. Well, guess what? If it's up to you, you can always be at peace with another person. You just can't make them be at peace with you. And so until the second coming, I think that that's the stance of Christians. And it's always sad, and sometimes it makes me a little angry when I read about parents who just basically cast aside their children because they, voted for Joe Biden or, became atheists or something. It's like, look, those things can be false, those things can be wrong, but there's no reason why those things should break your relationship with them. If they want to break relationship with you, that's on them. But as far as you're concerned, you do whatever you can to be at peace with them. Okay? Right here. I hope you have your Apple Watch or Garmin device on because you're really going to get your steps in today.
First, a very quick comment. There's a book that we've enjoyed called The Question of God that has writings of C.S. Lewis and Sigmund Freud that we've found really helpful. It's not exactly this topic, but it's related to it. I don't know if you've...
Yeah, I actually have that book somewhere in a box. So.
Yeah, it's take it out of the box. It's blow the dust off. Blow the dust off of it.
Take it out of the box in which place where it's stored. I have boxes in a lot of different family houses. So,
but it's a really good book by a Harvard psychologist, I believe. I think something like that. But the thing I wanted to bring up very quickly here is, I think there's this challenge, and I wanted you to comment about it. How do we create a Mars Hill, a sort of an area where there is an environment for good discussion about these issues? It seems to me that often what we get is dogma and propaganda and people really fearing to even go into these discussions. And as an example, when certain family members of mine heard that we're knowing that our sons were going to go off to college, they're saying, well, be sure that they go to a conservative college, whatever that means, or be sure that they do this or that. It's like they're fearing that if they encounter some view that's different than a narrowly held view, that their lives are going to fall apart. And so in order to have these good discussions, I think we have to have permission to listen to some things that are very uncomfortable, and to ourselves, the tragedy. It's the tragedy of the closed mind. If you have an open-minded person talking to a closed-minded person, that's possibly the one mind can open. If you have two closed-minded people talking, it's not a real discussion.
Right.
So you are in your profession is you're supposed to be
By
on
profession,
the
I'm
best
an
place.
editor, so I correct people's grammar. That's my profession.
Yeah, there you go. But you also have spent your life in academic circles and things like that, So
Yeah.
So the question is, how do we as believers in love and in a way that is helpful and fruitful create safe spaces for discussions of these issues?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. For me, there's always you can't be completely open-minded. Nobody's completely open-minded. As if, do I exist today or not? I haven't made up my mind. We've all closed our minds on some things. I know that my name is George Wood, and I happen to have a father that's named George Wood, and no, I'm not open to objections to that, okay? So we've all closed our minds on some things, and we all have open mind about other things, right? So part of what I would say is that when the church is operating together as Christians, there are some things that we as a community have determined that are true. And so if somebody comes into our fellowship and says, well, I'm a Christian, but I think that the Trinity is nonsense, we say, that's a wonderful opinion to have, but not in our church. And so, to a certain degree, the conversations that you have with Christians about church, in church, etc., in certain contexts, they're a little bit more closed than the conversations that you would say have out in the world, okay? So that would be one thing, is where is the conversation taking place? I really think that you've hit on something that I think a lot of people are simply fearful, that if somehow we get some belief about something wrong, that even though we're Christians, God will judge us and send us to hell, or at least to one of the lesser mansions in heaven, When Paul says in Romans 10, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, there are loads of theology that flow out of those two simple statements. But they're simple statements. And Christians, cannot get everything right because we're fallible. We won't get everything right because there's just not enough time. And we don't have to get everything right because God saves sinners, not the perfect. Okay? So I think that we need to get rid of this fear because, as John says, fear comes from judgment. And we think that God is going to judge us if we get the details wrong. And maybe there are some make or break beliefs, like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 12, nobody says by the Spirit Jesus is cursed. That's a false belief. That puts you outside of the fellowship. But, clearly God loves fools and fallible people because there are a lot of them in church history and in this room and behind this pulpit. So, I think that we need to take fear off the table. One final thing, and the Wheaton student will appreciate this. One of my professors at Wheaton was Art Holmes, famous Christian philosopher from the mid to late 20th century. And Holmes was very well respected among Christian educators particularly. And one of his books is simply titled, All Truth is God's Truth. And for some reason, every now and then I find Christians who think that this is very controversial. And I'm like, why do you think that that's controversial? Well, that suggests maybe that if science says something that's true that doesn't accord with my interpretation of the Word of God, that might be truth. I'm like, yeah, maybe all that proves is your interpretation of the Word of God is wrong. So we have to be open to talking with people and learning. Because just because a belief is strongly held by our kind of people, and it's what we were taught, and it's what Grandpappy back before the Civil War believed, doesn't mean that it's true. For Christians, you always go to Scripture because that's the ultimate source of authority. But God also reveals himself in nature, and sometimes you have to just kind of look and say, well, what is nature trying to teach me? Because God is teaching me through nature. And not only that, sometimes in terms of what we believe, we have to look back at church history and say, has this been widely held in Christian history? Has there been a range of opinion that's been allowed? Or is this a novel idea, or is this even a heretical idea? And then, of course, sometimes we just have to look at our own experience of the world and say, it just doesn't jibe well with me. And so you have these four senses or four sources of authority in terms of your beliefs, Scripture, reason, tradition, and experience. And Scripture's, of course, at the top, but these other things also can be guides. And so if we're not open to hearing other people, even atheists, telling us something true, what we're saying is, I've got it all right, as I am now. And being a philosophy major from Wheaton, the first thing that's drilled into you as a philosophy student is the paradox that the Oracle of Delphi told Socrates. The Oracle of Delphi, this strange demonic oracle, said, Socrates, you are the wisest man in Athens. And Socrates thought, I'm not that smart. So he wanted to figure out how in the world the Oracle of Delphi could be true. And what he finally came to realize was, I'm the smartest man in Athens because I know what I don't know. And so just as we come before God with humility, in many ways we have to come before others with humility, and we have to come before reality with humility because we have stuff to learn. Now again, there are points at which we close our minds around a truth, and we don't have to constantly reopen it and, mess with the oil and change the battery and all that kind of stuff. There are points at which we close our minds around the truth. Jesus Christ is Lord. I'm not particularly willing to change that. However, politics. You brought up the conservative Christian college. Okay, are we talking theologically conservative or politically conservative? Can Christians be Democrats?
I think people get those terms confused.
Well, maybe. It's amazing to me that all my Republican friends, and I won't tell you how I'm registered, but anyway, all my Republican friends who are Christians are just constantly saying, I don't understand how Christians can vote for Democrats. All my Democratic Christian friends are saying, I honestly don't understand how Christians could vote for Donald Trump. And there's this sort of mutual stupefaction about how could a Christian ever vote for X or Y, right? And I'm kind of like, well, sit down and talk to him. Maybe you'll learn something. And, in our society, which uses often terms as sort of shibboleths to say, you're on our side and you're not, there's all sorts of reasons to be divisive and not to talk to people. What's your take on critical race theory? Are you woke or are you asleep? What do you believe about systemic justice? What do you believe about white male privilege? What do you believe about LGBT issues and environmentalism? Do you think the homeless really ought to be out on the street? I think the government should just pay for their apartments. There's all sorts of range of opinions out there. I've met all sorts of Christians, and all sorts of Christians have had all sorts of opinions on all sorts of questions. Sometimes you just got to sit down and start learning, well, as Christians, we agree on this. We disagree on this, and we shouldn't. Or we disagree on this, and we can. But you're only going to know those things if you actually will talk to people. If you foreclose a relationship, you're not only foreclosing a relationship, you're also foreclosing an opportunity to understand more or learn something or provide more nuance and texture to your beliefs. Does that make sense? Maybe one more question, or are we done? Everybody's glazed over look like, please stop, George. My wife is like, but I haven't even gotten to the history of the sundial, babe. Okay, last question.
It's more like a kind of a comment than a real question. But as we talk about relationships and having these conversations, which I am actually in the midst of relational conversation with my sibling, having that relationship provides you that opportunity. My common phrase right now is compassion without compromise. We can't compromise truth for, getting them to a certain point. And one of the things is when we try to converse with those that do not have a biblical standing of truth, trying to converse with them of backing up truth with a Bible doesn't work. So these types of strategies that you've provided in working through the thought process of the philosophy, they're more open to. But we still have to be cautious as not trying to convert them to our truth, because to them, oftentimes, truth, reality, morality is subjective.
Yeah.
And, it's
Or it's subjective and they just think that our interpretation of it is wrong.
exactly.
Yeah, and I think that the key phrase there is that compassion without compromise. It's interesting to me that we often think that compassion without compromising truth. I see a lot of us compromising compassion. But the problem among us evangelicals and Pentecostals is not that we are indifferent to truth. We are unwilling to compromise truth. We're okay with letting relationships slide. And I think there that the priorities are wrong. But yeah, I agree with you. If someone disagrees with you, you have to find the points of agreement that are that you share in agreement with them and reason from those points, or you have to find ways of talking to them in terms that they understand and reason your way through the arguments and conclusions. You can't just come up and browbeat somebody with the Bible and think it's going to be effective. Paul didn't do that, by the way. We often think that Paul just rolled into a town and preached the gospel, and he just erected a big gospel tent and put the sawdust down and invited everybody down. And if they didn't respond, he just shook the dust off his feet and said, "Oh, you're all going to hell. I've done my job," got in his convertible and drove away with the offering. I think that that's sometimes our impression of Acts. And the reality is, if you look at the details, you find Paul in Ephesus for 2 years renting out the hall of Tyrannus, and just basically from morning to evening teaching, but dialoguing, debating, explaining. If you go through and look at Greek at the terms that Luke uses to describe Paul's ministry of speaking, he uses this full range of philosophical terms that we get dialogue from, and dialectic and logic and all these other terms. And that's not just, I preached it, I called you for a decision, you didn't decide, I'm out of here. Here's what I'd like to propose. But I don't like that. Well, let me respond to that. But I don't like that. Well, let me give you a different answer. Well, what about this? Well, and so there's an ongoing process, and evidently, at least at Ephesus, it took 2 years. And Ephesus became the epicenter for the spread of the gospel throughout Asia. So I think oftentimes as Pentecostals, as revivalists, we just think all you have to do is roll into town, preach the gospel, and then take off. Whereas the actual example of what Paul's doing is something more like sitting down and having a long conversation, not over coffee, but over the course of weeks and months. And that's why putting a premium on relationship is so important. Yes, you need to be telling them the truth, but yes, you need to be open in the relationship as well. It's the truth and the relationship. It's the truth and the grace together that people find persuasive. Well, folks, this has been fun for me. I don't know if you've enjoyed it at all, but I enjoy getting up and talking. So thank you for coming these next few weeks. I would tell you what's happening next week, but I actually don't know. So just come and be surprised like me, okay? We'll see you next Wednesday.